The train cut through the prairie like a rusted needle, dragging its steel thread toward the sun-blasted horizon. Dust clawed at the windows. Inside, Caroline Holt sat stiff-spined on a splintered bench, her hands folded atop a small leather satchel that held all she had left: two dresses, a letter of rejection, and the remnants of a life that had dried up in the parlor of a Boston doctor. She had answered the advertisement months ago, pressed between Bible pages at the church shelter. Seeking sober woman, able-bodied, good with children, willing to relocate west, marriage intended, widower, owns land. The ink had bled at the edges from rain or tears, it didn't matter. What mattered was it promised a future with her name inside it. She wrote back in careful cursive. Her letters were plain but earnest. The man, Thomas Dalton, had responded twice. Sparse notes, practical. A widow, he said, 2 children, needed help on the ranch and in the home, no room for softness. That suited her fine. Then the second letter stopped her breath. I'm sorry, but I can't marry a barren woman. My boy needs a mother who can give him siblings, not just tend his wounds. That had been 4 weeks ago. Caroline still carried the letter like a wound she dared not show. But the ticket west was already bought. She came anyway. There was nothing left for her in Boston, not after the man she married succumbed to the flu and the child they tried for never came. She stepped off the train in Wilkes Hollow, Wyoming, in a gray wool coat too fine for this part of the world. The station master squinted at her as if she'd wandered off a better life. You sure this is your stop? He asked. She nodded. Yes, I'm looking for the Dalton ranch. His mouth twisted into something between pity and wariness. South Road, 5 miles. Ask for Clem if you want a mule. Weather's turning. She walked. The sky pressed low with a hard light that made everything look bleached and used up. When she crested the last hill, the Dalton place sat folded into a shallow basin of land. A barn slouched like it had given up holding itself straight. The house was 2 stories but looked hollowed, as if laughter had been driven from it and never returned. A boy stood near the fence, maybe 10. He watched her with the caution of something feral. She raised a hand. He didn't wave back. A girl, younger and with wild curls, peeked from the porch. Thomas Dalton came out a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing thick forearms. He looked older than his 30-some years, his face scored with sun and sorrow. When he saw her, he stopped moving. I told you not to come, he said flatly. Caroline swallowed. I came as a housekeeper, you need one. I need a wife who can give me more children. I can give yours a mother. He shook his head. My boy don't trust easy. My girl don't talk much. You show up pretending to be what you ain't, you'll just make things worse. I'm not pretending, she said, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. I know I can't bear children, but I can cook, I can sew, I can care for what's already here. You won't find better. The boy came closer, still watching. His boots made no sound on the dry dirt. The girl clutched a rag doll against her chest. Thomas didn't answer, but when he turned back toward the house, he didn't tell her to leave. That night she slept in the spare room above the kitchen, where mice scratched behind the walls and the window refused to close all the way. She unpacked her dresses. She hung them with care. She folded the rejection letter and placed it in the drawer under her underthings. At dawn, she was up before the rooster. She kneaded dough and scraped the old cast iron clean. She found the girl, Lottie, sitting on the floor with her doll and whispered a good morning. The child didn't reply but didn't run either. The boy, Edward, sat at the table like a judge. He looked at his plate, then at her, then said, My ma used to put lard in the biscuits. Caroline looked at him evenly. Your ma isn't here anymore. He said nothing, but he ate every bite. Weeks passed, she kept to her chores. She patched the barn roof with Thomas when the storms came. He stopped talking about finding another bride. He stopped writing letters at all. One night, the wind howled like something dying out in the hills. Caroline heard the girl crying and found her tangled in sweat-soaked sheets. She held the child until the sobs slowed. Lottie didn't speak, but her small fingers gripped the hem of Caroline's nightgown as if it was the only thing anchoring her. In the morning, Lottie followed her into the kitchen and set the table without being asked. Edward watched it all. He didn't say anything for a long while. Then one evening, as the sun blistered down red behind the cottonwoods, he brought Caroline a tin badge he'd found in the barn. It was bent and rusted, but still held a shape. "My pa used to be sheriff," he said. "He kept this when he quit, said it reminded him what he lost." She turned it in her hand. What did he lose? Edward shrugged. Mama died. People stopped needing a lawman he don't talk about either. He walked away before she could answer. Later that same week, Thomas came in from branding calves and stood in the doorway watching her braid Lottie's hair. He looked at the child, then at Caroline, then back to the half-moon scar on his palm. His voice was low. "I don't hear her cry anymore." Caroline tied the braid with a strip of calico. She still does, just quieter now. Thomas said nothing, but he didn't leave the doorway. That night, while the wind rattled the shutters and the fire went low, Edward crept into her room without knocking. He stood beside her bed in the dark, his voice flat. "If you leave, I'll run away. I swear I will." Caroline sat up slowly. "I'm not leaving." He blinked. "Even if Pa don't marry you." She nodded even then. He stood there a long moment. Then he whispered, "Okay, Mama," and closed the door behind him. She cried then silently into the crook of her arm. She didn't want the man anymore, not like before. She wanted the home, the silence, the slow mending, the lives broken around her that had, somehow, started to wrap themselves around the bones of her own. And somewhere deep in the walls, the house stopped groaning. It had taken her in, just like the children. Even if their father hadn't yet. Winter came harder than the years before. The snows pressed down on the plains like a hand on a throat, and travel into town slowed to once a month, if that. The Dalton ranch settled into silence, broken only by the daily rituals that now belonged to all of them. Caroline hauled water and cracked ice, mended gloves worn through at the thumbs. She taught Lottie to knit, though the girl never spoke a word. Edward began to shadow Thomas in the barn, and when he came back smelling of hay and sweat, he tracked his muddy boots over the floor without shame. Caroline scolded him, and he smirked at her the way a boy does when he knows he has a place. Thomas remained a thing of few words. He rode out before sunup most days, fed his cattle, checked the fences, shot a coyote when he had to. Sometimes at supper he lingered by the fire, his eyes catching on Caroline when she brushed Lottie's hair or sipped coffee from a chipped blue mug. But he never said more than he had to, and the space between them held. She didn't push. Then came the night the stranger arrived. He was drunk or near to it and slumped off his horse like a sack of grain. Caroline saw him first through the kitchen window, just a shifting shadow at the edge of the barn, too big to be Thomas. She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, and called out before the dogs could bark. He looked up slow, bleary-eyed. "This the Dalton place?" "It is," she said, the butt of the rifle firm against her shoulder. "I'm looking for work." She didn't lower the weapon. "You're looking for warmth." He smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes. "Ain't that the same thing these days?" Thomas came up from behind then, his horse wet with snow melt. He dismounted and studied the man for a long time. "Name's Wade Keller," the stranger said. "Used to run cattle up near Cheyenne. Winter tore us apart." Thomas stared at him. "I've got no money for hire, but there's hay to be cut and traps to be checked." Wade nodded. "A bed and food's enough." So he stayed. At first he kept to himself. He worked harder than most and didn't complain, but he watched too much. His eyes lingered on Caroline when they shouldn't. He talked too easily to Edward, asking questions about the ranch, about his father, about Caroline. The boy, sharp despite his youth, grew colder around him. "I don't like him," Edward said one morning as they collected eggs. "He lies without blinking." Caroline touched his shoulder. "That's a good thing to notice. You don't need to trust him." Edward nodded like he was memorizing her words. Weeks passed. Wade began helping in the house when storms trapped them indoors. He whittled a toy for Lottie, who ignored it. He offered to sharpen knives, but Caroline kept hers close. Then came the night the barn caught fire. It started fast, too fast, flames in the rafters, licking dry wood with eager tongues. Caroline smelled the smoke first and tore out of the house barefoot, Thomas behind her. He shouted for Edward to get water, and the boy obeyed without question. Wade was already outside, holding a pitchfork. Caroline froze. "You didn't try to stop it." He shrugged. It was too far gone. Thomas turned on him. "You were out here. How the hell did it start?" Wade's mouth twitched. "You saying I lit it?" Thomas stared at him. The fire cracked behind them, devouring the west side of the barn. "I'm saying it's too damn convenient." They fought the blaze all night. By morning, half the feed was gone, and one heifer had to be put down. Wade left that afternoon. Caroline watched his figure shrink down the road and vanish into the ash-gray distance. She didn't ask Thomas if he'd forced him out. She didn't need to. In the quiet that followed, something shifted between them. She found Thomas mending fence wire one morning, with his hand wrapped in cloth. "You should have let me help," she said, nodding at the wound. He didn't look up. "You already helped too much." "I don't understand." "I know you don't," he said, and his voice cracked like ice. "That's what scares me." He stood then and walked toward the hills, where the trees thinned into open sky. That night Lottie crawled into Caroline's bed again. She didn't cry. She only curled there, warm and silent. In spring, Thomas took to disappearing for long hours. Caroline kept the place running. She helped Edward dig out fence posts, taught him how to hold a rifle without flinching. She stitched new shirts from old cloth and taught Lottie to read by candlelight. The girl still hadn't spoken a word, but her eyes had grown brighter. Sometimes she laughed. Then came a letter, postmarked from Casper, dirty with soot and blood around the corners. It was addressed to Thomas, but folded open by Edward, who had run all the way from the gate. Caroline read it once, then again. Her hands shook. Wade Keller had been caught robbing a depot west of town. He'd killed a man. Claimed he had work on the Dalton ranch, said Thomas owed him wages. The law wanted to ask questions. Thomas came home 2 days later, covered in trail dust. When she handed him the letter, he stared at it for a long time without reading. Then he folded it and placed it in the stove without a word. "You going to let them come?" she asked. He looked at her like a man remembering how to be looked at. "I've let too many things come, not this." Later that evening, he sat beside the fire, silent while the wind rattled the walls. Caroline brought him tea and sat across from him. "You never asked why I came," she said. He met her eyes. "I figured I already knew." "You don't," she said. "Not really." He didn't press, just nodded once, like that was enough for now. That night she found Lottie's doll tucked beside her own pillow. Its eyes were buttons. Its mouth was a single stitched line. Caroline held it in her lap for a long while. Then she whispered, "Good night, Mama," to the dark. Not for her own sake, for someone else. And the house seemed to breathe again. Not with grief, but with the possibility that something else might be built in its place. The thaw came slow that year. Ice melted in thin sheets off the roof, and the creek behind the Dalton ranch bloomed open with a low, steady groan. Everything seemed to wake up hungry, wolves, men, memory. Caroline stood barefoot in the doorway one morning, steam rising from the coffee in her hand, and saw Lottie leading a lamb on a twine leash across the yard. The girl's lips moved, soundless, as if whispering spells. Her eyes were bright. Something was blooming in her, too. Edward had taken to carving things from scrap wood, horses, rifles, a crooked likeness of their old barn. He carried a jackknife in his pocket like it was a badge. Caroline made him a leather sheath and stitched his initials in the back. He didn't say thank you, just pressed it against his belt like it had always been there. Thomas worked harder than ever. He replaced the barn walls plank by plank, using reclaimed wood from the old schoolhouse out by Crooked Tree Ridge. Caroline saw him pause sometimes, looking toward the hills like they owed him something. Maybe they did. One morning, a rider came from town, Deputy Callum Shaw, a man with a lazy eye and a badge he polished more than he used. He sat tall in his saddle, but carried the look of a man sent to do someone else's errand. "Got word Wade Keller's hanging next week," he said. "Judge wants to know if Dalton'll testify he never paid him, something about closure." Thomas stood on the porch, arms crossed, hat low. "I won't testify," he said. "You sure?" Callum asked, chewing the edge of his lip. "You're the only one can say for certain he wasn't owed." "He burned my barn, scared my boy. That's testimony enough." Callum nodded and turned to Caroline. "They said Keller had a woman with him in Casper. Some claim she was part of the robbery. She's saying she got letters from this ranch, too." Caroline's breath caught. Letters. He squinted, said she answered an ad, said she was promised marriage. "I never sent for any other woman," Thomas said, voice flat. "Didn't figure you did," Callum said, reins twitching. "Just thought you'd want to know." He rode off before they could ask more. That evening, Thomas didn't come inside. Caroline found him beside the barn, one hand pressed to the raw timber. She didn't speak until he did. "I used to think grief was something you buried, deep enough it wouldn't rot the rest of your life." She waited. "But it seeps, it finds its way back up. You're not the only one carrying it." His mouth twisted. "I know, that's the worst part." She stepped closer. "Let me help you carry it." He turned. His eyes were rimmed red, but he didn't cry. "What if I don't know how?" "Then we'll learn." He nodded once, just once, and went inside. That night, Lottie spoke. Caroline found her sitting beside Edward on the floor, trying to tie the lamb's leash into a lopsided bow. Her voice came low and steady, like she'd always known how, but had forgotten she was allowed. "She needs a name," Lottie said. Edward blinked. "You talked." Lottie didn't flinch. "I'm not broken, just quiet." Caroline knelt beside them. Her heart hurt in a strange, warm way. "What's her name, then?" Lottie smiled, small but real. "Mercy." The word hung there, strange and clean. Caroline swallowed hard. From that moment on, Lottie never stopped speaking. She wasn't loud, never would be, but she told stories to the lamb, asked questions at supper, and once told Caroline she liked her singing, even when it was off-key. Edward, too, softened. He asked if he could help cook. Caroline taught him how to knead bread, how to tell when dough had risen enough just by touch. One evening, Caroline stepped into the barn and saw something drawn into the dust on the wall. A picture of 4 stick figures, Thomas, Caroline, Edward, and Lottie. Above them, a son, nothing else, no extra child, no imagined future, just what was already here. She didn't ask who had drawn it. She only ran her hand across the wood and left it there. But not all was calm. A letter came from the judge in Casper, direct, formal. "If Thomas Dalton will not testify, then Ms. Caroline Holt may be summoned. Wade Keller insists she was known to him, that she invited his company, that the Dalton ranch offered refuge to both of them. her silence implicates. Caroline read it once and burned it in the stove, as Thomas had done with the first. He saw the smoke, said nothing. But that night, as they sat by the fire, he spoke again. I buried my wife beneath the cottonwood grove. You passed it coming in. I remember. I used to go there every Sunday, tell her about the kids, about the weather, about how things broke and didn't fix right. Then one day I stopped talking. Caroline looked at him. Why? Because you were already here. She said nothing, let the silence answer. Later, as she blew out the lamps, Lottie came to her and held Caroline's hand without speaking. Then, from the dark, Edward's voice. You don't need a paper to be Mama, you just are. Caroline stood there in the dark hallway, the children quiet beside her, and understood something had happened that no court, no judge, no man with a badge could undo. They'd chosen her. Not because she could give them more, but because she'd given them enough. The rains came with the thaw, and with them the road turned to mud thick enough to swallow wagon wheels and slow horses to a crawl. In the morning light, the Dalton ranch seemed to rise from the earth like a ship from a drowning sea, its foundation sunk deep and stubborn into the land. Caroline stood at the window, her hands streaked with flour, watching the low clouds coil over the horizon. Lottie and Edward were in the barn, practicing halter knots. She could hear their voices now, Lottie's high and soft, Edward's patient but proud. That small, steady music of a family settling into place. But peace doesn't last long on the frontier. Not when blood been spilled and names are remembered. They came at dusk. Two riders, both in dust-stained dusters, one clean-shaven and the other pockmarked like scorched bark. They didn't announce themselves, just stood in the yard while the sky bruised behind them. Thomas stepped out first, rifle already in hand. Caroline followed, Lottie clinging to her skirts. Edward stood just behind the porch post, his eyes fixed on the strangers. The clean-shaven one spoke first. Evenin', we're looking for Miss Holt. Caroline didn't flinch. I'm here. You knew Wade Keller. I knew he set fire to this barn. I knew he threatened this family. He smiled, thin and knowing. You also knew him before that. Casper Papers said you were seen with him, said you two might have had an understanding. Thomas's voice dropped low. You accusing her of something. Not accusing, just here for answers. Judge wants her in Casper to speak. If she's innocent, won't take but a day. Thomas stepped off the porch, slow and hard. You're not talking her. The pockmarked man shifted in his saddle. Ain't your choice, she's not your wife. The words hit like buckshot. Thomas's grip tightened on the rifle. She's family, that's enough. Caroline moved past him, her voice level. If I don't go, they'll come back worse. Next time with papers, or worse, a noose. Lottie sobbed behind her. Don't leave. Caroline turned, knelt, pulled her close. I'll come back, you hear me. But part of her didn't believe it. The ride to Casper took 2 days, longer with the mud. The lawmen were silent most of the way, offering no fire and no courtesy. Caroline wrapped herself in her coat and listened to the groan of wagon wheels and the wheeze of the pockmarked man's horse. They reached the jailhouse at dawn. A thin man behind a desk told her to wait in a cell. It wasn't locked, but it didn't need to be. The walls said enough. Keller was already dead. Hanged before her arrival. His last request, her presence, his final words claimed love and betrayal. The judge was an old man with dull eyes and too many rings. He called her into chambers like she was a schoolgirl, asked her to explain. I answered a letter, she said. From a man who offered marriage, I came west alone. Keller showed up later, asking for shelter. I never promised him anything. He peered at her. You don't deny knowing him before. She hesitated. I knew of him. He once worked near my husband's uncle, but we weren't anything. He tapped a paper. This woman he traveled with says otherwise. She's lying. Why would she lie? Because he's dead and can't defend her now. He leaned back. Then why would you come if you didn't feel guilty? She stared at him. Because I'm not afraid of the truth. He let her go that evening. No apology, no explanation. Just a grunted dismissal and a thin envelope for her travel home. She rode alone. On the third morning, the Dalton ranch rose into view again, smaller somehow, but waiting. Edward stood at the fence, arms crossed like a sentry. He didn't wave, just watched. Caroline stepped down from the wagon with shaking knees. Lottie ran to her first, burying her face in Caroline's coat. Edward followed, his arms crossed, then uncrossed. He spoke softly. Pa, been in the barn since morning, won't talk to nobody. Caroline nodded, kissed their foreheads, and walked toward the barn. Inside, Thomas stood near the wall, staring at a post. A carving had been made deep into the wood. It read, M.H. My wife's name, he said without turning. I know. I carved it after she died. Told myself no other woman would live here under her name. Caroline waited. He turned slowly. Then I thought maybe I'd just keep the rest of my life empty, a tribute. She stepped closer, and now. He reached out not to touch her, just to close the space between. I don't want a tribute, I want a life. And it's you, Caroline, it's always been you. Her breath caught. You still think a piece of paper matters? He asked. She shook her head. I think what matters is this, Edward watching us from the fence. Lottie calling my name in her sleep, your voice in the dark when I thought I couldn't feel anything again. He nodded, then I'll take your hand, if you'll let me. She did. And that night, after the supper was cleared and the wind began to rise again, Lottie curled beside her on the settle near the hearth. Tell me a story, the girl whispered. Caroline smiled. About what? About a woman who had no children, but became a mother anyway. Caroline's voice was quiet. That's not a story, that's just the truth. And the fire cracked like laughter, low and warm, as if the house had finally made peace with its ghosts. Summer came like a reward, slow, deliberate, spilling color back into the land. The grass on the Dalton ranch thickened, green and humming with crickets. The cattle fattened, the creek ran high. For the first time in years, the earth felt generous. Caroline rose with the sun, her hands calloused and strong. Lottie helped her hang linens, her small fingers learning the rhythm of clothespins and wind. Edward spent most days out in the field with Thomas, breaking a wild chestnut gelding. They were quieter now, the kind of quiet built from trust, not distance. One Sunday morning, Caroline stood at the grave beneath the cottonwoods. The wooden marker still bore the initials M.H., now grayed by weather, softened by moss. She didn't cry. Instead, she crouched and laid a sprig of lavender on the earth. I'm not replacing you, she whispered. I'm only loving what you left behind. A breeze stirred through the trees. She stood, turned, and didn't look back. By midsummer, the barn stood taller than before, rebuilt with steadier hands. Lottie named the new lambs herself. Mercy had grown fat and soft, often found napping in the shade with the girl curled beside her like a second fleece. They didn't speak often of the fire, or Wade Keller, or the letters. But the story of it stayed in the bones of the house, like the memory of a scar you don't need to hide, only understand. One morning, Thomas came in from the field and placed a folded paper on the kitchen table. What's this? Caroline asked, wiping her hands on her apron. Marriage license, he said. Filled out, just needs your name beside mine. She didn't move to take it, only looked at him. I thought you said we didn't need paper, she said. I was wrong, he said. Sometimes you do, not for the world, for the children, for you, for me. He pulled something else from his coat pocket, 2 simple silver rings, dulled with age. These were my parents. I never thought I'd give them to anyone. Caroline stepped forward and took the ring without a word, slipped it on herself. It fit. They married under the cottonwoods, just the 4 of them. Edward stood beside Thomas, proud and fidgeting in a coat too tight across the shoulders. Lottie wore a crown of wildflowers. Caroline's dress was the same blue calico she'd arrived in, hem restitched by her own hand. No preacher, no neighbors, no vows beyond the ones they lived every day. That night, after the fire had burned low and the children had gone to bed, Thomas and Caroline sat on the porch, hands resting between them. "You still regret coming?" he asked. She looked out at the land, so wide, so cruel, so endlessly capable of change. "No," she said, "because this isn't where the story ended, it's where it began." From behind them, the sound of small feet padding down the stairs. Lottie, sleepy-eyed, dragging her blanket. "Can I sleep with you?" she asked, voice thick with dream. Caroline opened her arms, always. As the girl climbed into her lap and the wind bent the prairie grass in slow waves, Thomas leaned back and closed his eyes. "You know," he said, half smiling, "I think you were the one who rescued us." Caroline looked down at the child in her arms, then up at the dark outline of the barn, the house, the sky stretching wide above them. "No," she said, "we saved each other." And in the hush that followed, beneath the stars and the stillness, the Dalton place breathed like a living thing, rebuilt, renamed, and filled again. Not with blood, but with belonging, with mercy, with Mama, forever.